The sound of heavy raindrops echoed through the dense forest, their rhythmic patter interrupted only by the occasional crack of a breaking branch or the rustle of unseen creatures. Deep within this isolated stretch of wilderness, a place untouched by modern hands, a young woman named Amelia clutched her backpack tightly as she navigated the narrow, winding path ahead. Her face, illuminated by the dim glow of a flashlight, betrayed a mix of determination and unease. She wasn't here by choice. This was a journey born of necessity. Amelia had spent years chasing answers. Her brother, Ethan, had disappeared without a trace 6 years ago while hiking in these same woods. The authorities had declared it a tragic accident, another young soul lost to the perils of nature. But Amelia never believed it. Ethan was experienced, careful, and the stories surrounding these woods, stories of strange sightings and whispered legends, hinted at something far darker than a simple misstep. Tonight, she had decided to find out the truth for herself. As she moved deeper into the forest, the trees seemed to close in around her. The air grew colder, the shadows longer. It was said that the forest had a way of turning people around, making them lose their sense of direction, even in broad daylight. But Amelia had come prepared. A GPS device beeped steadily in her pocket, marking the route she had painstakingly planned. Yet, the farther she ventured, the more she felt a peculiar pull, as if something unseen was guiding her toward an unknown destination. The first sign of something amiss came when Amelia stumbled upon a clearing she didn't recognize. In the center stood a towering oak tree, its gnarled branches spreading wide like an ancient sentinel. At its base was a ring of stones, each one carved with symbols she couldn't decipher. The ground inside the circle was unnaturally smooth, untouched by the fallen leaves that blanketed the rest of the forest floor. Her flashlight flickered briefly as she stepped closer, the beam catching what appeared to be fresh footprints leading into the circle. They were small, childlike, and disappeared as abruptly as they began. A chill ran down her spine as she crouched to inspect them. The air felt heavier here, charged with an inexplicable energy. Amelia's heart pounded as she scanned the area, half expecting to see someone, or something, emerge from the shadows. But the forest remained silent, almost as if it were holding its breath. She stood and reached for her GPS, only to find the screen glitching, the signal lost. Then, faintly at first, she heard it, a low hum, melodic and haunting, emanating from somewhere beyond the clearing. It wasn't mechanical, it sounded almost like a voice. Amelia hesitated, torn between the primal urge to flee and the unshakable need to follow. Taking a deep breath, she stepped beyond the circle of stones, the hum growing louder with every step. Suddenly, the light from her flashlight dimmed completely, plunging her into darkness. And then, just as her eyes adjusted, a figure emerged from the shadows ahead, its outline barely discernible but undeniably human, or so it seemed. Amelia froze, her breath caught in her throat. The figure stood just beyond the faint light cast by the rising moon, motionless yet undeniably watching her. Every instinct screamed at her to turn back, but her legs refused to move. Instead, she found herself gripping the flashlight tighter, as if the weight of it could somehow protect her from whatever, or whoever, was in front of her. "Hello," she called out, her voice trembling but steady enough to carry through the stillness of the night. No response. The figure shifted slightly, and for a fleeting moment, she thought she saw the glint of eyes reflecting the moonlight. It was enough to jolt her into action. Summoning her courage, she stepped forward, the crunch of leaves beneath her feet breaking the oppressive silence. The figure seemed to retreat, moving deeper into the shadows without a sound. Amelia followed, her heart pounding in her chest as she wove through the trees. "Wait. Please, I just need to talk to you," she pleaded, but the figure disappeared beyond her line of sight, leaving her alone once again. The hum returned, louder this time and more distinct. It wasn't just a sound, it was layered, like a chorus of voices blending into one hypnotic melody. Amelia tried to pinpoint its source, turning in slow circles, but it seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. Her pulse quickened as the sound pulled her further into the woods, each step feeling less like her own and more like she was being led. She stumbled into another clearing, this one larger and more open, with strange patterns etched into the dirt. The symbols looked ancient, like something out of a forgotten language. In the center stood a stone pedestal, weathered and cracked, with what appeared to be a small wooden box resting on top. The hum seemed to radiate from the pedestal itself, vibrating faintly in the air around it. Amelia hesitated, her instincts battling against her curiosity. Something about the box felt important, too important to ignore. She approached cautiously, her flashlight casting eerie shadows across the clearing. As she reached the pedestal, she noticed something etched into the side of the stone. It was a name. Her brother's name. Ethan. The letters were jagged, as if they'd been carved hastily, but they were unmistakable. Her breath hitched as she reached out to touch the engraving, her fingers trembling. How could his name be here, in the middle of this isolated forest? Before she could process the thought, the hum shifted, becoming sharper, more insistent. The box rattled slightly, and a cold gust of wind swept through the clearing, extinguishing the small beam of light from her flashlight. Darkness enveloped her, and panic set in. She fumbled with the flashlight, slapping it against her palm in desperation, but it refused to turn back on. Then a whisper, faint but clear. "Amelia!" She spun around, searching for the source of the voice, but there was no one there. Her heart pounded as the whisper came again, closer this time. "Amelia! You shouldn't be here." The voice was familiar, achingly so, and her knees nearly gave way as she recognized it. It was Ethan's voice. Amelia's chest tightened as she spun around, the voice of her brother echoing in her ears. The clearing seemed darker now, as if the forest itself was closing in. "Ethan," she called out, her voice cracking. She could barely hear herself over the pounding of her heart. The name carved into the stone, the whisper. It was impossible, yet it was happening. She felt a chill crawl up her spine as the hum shifted again, this time blending with the faint sound of footsteps crunching through the leaves. She strained her eyes, trying to see through the shadows, but the darkness was too thick. "Ethan, is that you?" she called again, her voice trembling. The footsteps stopped, replaced by a heavy silence that pressed down on her like a weight. She stepped closer to the pedestal, her fingers brushing the wooden box. It felt cold, unnaturally so, and she hesitated, unsure if opening it would bring her answers or more questions. Before she could decide, a soft laugh echoed from somewhere nearby, a laugh she recognized. It was Ethan's laugh, but it wasn't right. It sounded warped, like it had been stretched and twisted into something unrecognizable. "You don't belong here, Amelia," the voice said again, now clearer and closer. It was undeniably her brother, but there was something wrong with it, something that made her skin crawl. "I'm here to find you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I need to know what happened to you." She tightened her grip on the edge of the pedestal, using it to steady herself as her knees threatened to give out. The hum grew louder, more dissonant, and she felt a vibration beneath her fingertips, as though the box was alive. The laugh came again, this time from behind her. She spun around, her breath hitching as her eyes landed on a figure standing just at the edge of the clearing. It looked like Ethan, same height, same build, even the same jacket he was wearing the day he disappeared, but his face was obscured, hidden in shadow. "You shouldn't have come," he said, his tone sharp and cold, nothing like the warmth she remembered. "You don't understand what this place is." "Then help me understand," she pleaded, taking a cautious step toward him. The figure didn't move, but the hum seemed to intensify, rattling her teeth and making her vision blur. "Then please. I just want to bring you home." The figure tilted its head, as if considering her words, but then its voice softened, almost mournful. "There is no home for me anymore, Amelia. There's only this." He gestured toward the pedestal, and the box rattled violently, the sound cutting through the hum like a scream. She stumbled back, her eyes darting between the figure and the box. "What's inside?" she asked, her voice shaking. The figure didn't answer. Instead, it began to dissolve, the edges of its form breaking apart like smoke caught in the wind. "Ethan!" she screamed, running toward him, but by the time she reached the spot where he had stood, he was gone. The hum subsided, leaving an eerie stillness in its wake. Amelia turned back to the pedestal, her breathing ragged. The box now sat perfectly still, as if nothing had happened. But she knew better. Something was inside it, something tied to Ethan's disappearance and the strange forces that seemed to control this forest. She reached out again, her fingers hovering over the lid. The air around her felt electric, charged with an energy she couldn't explain. She had to know. Whatever was inside, it held the key to everything. Taking a deep breath, she gripped the edges of the box and lifted the lid. What she saw made her blood run cold. It wasn't what she expected. It wasn't something she could have prepared for. The box was empty, but somehow she knew that the real horror was only just beginning. Amelia stared into the empty box, her mind racing. Didn't make sense. The hum, the vibrations, the carvings, everything had led her here. She felt like she was missing something, a crucial piece of the puzzle just out of reach. The air around her felt heavier now, pressing down like an invisible weight. The silence that followed was deafening, as if the entire forest was holding its breath. Then the hum returned, sharper and more chaotic than before. It didn't come from the pedestal this time. It was everywhere, above her, behind her, beneath her feet. She stumbled back, clutching the box as the ground beneath her began to tremble. Shadows flickered at the edges of her vision, darting between the trees. She spun around, her flashlight still dead in her hand, unable to banish the encroaching darkness. "Ethan," she called out again, her voice almost a whisper. But the forest didn't answer. Instead, the hum twisted into something new. Words, fragmented and distorted. It sounded like voices overlapping, echoing in a language she couldn't understand. She tried to focus, to pick out something familiar, but the words seemed to tangle together, pulling at her thoughts like invisible threads. The pedestal cracked with a loud snap, splitting down the center as a faint light began to seep from within. Amelia shielded her eyes, the brightness cutting through the darkness like a blade. The light pulsed, rhythmic and alive, illuminating the symbols carved into the stones around her. She could see now that the patterns weren't random. They connected, forming a network that radiated outward from the pedestal, stretching into the forest like veins. Before she could react, the light surged, engulfing her in a blinding flash. When it faded, she wasn't in the clearing anymore. The forest was still there, but it was different. The trees seemed taller, their trunks twisted into unnatural shapes. The ground beneath her feet was soft and damp, like moss, but it glowed faintly, casting an otherworldly light. The air was thick and cold, carrying the faint smell of rain and something metallic. Amelia turned in slow circles, trying to make sense of where she was. Her heart pounded as she realized the forest wasn't silent anymore. Low whispers floated on the wind, growing louder and more insistent with every passing moment. They weren't coming from one direction. They were everywhere, surrounding her. It felt like the forest itself was alive, watching her, waiting for something. And then she saw it. At the edge of the glowing trees stood a figure, tall and unrecognizable in the dim light. It wasn't Ethan. She could tell that much. Its silhouette was wrong. Too thin, too angular, and its movements were unervingly smooth as it stepped closer. The whispers grew louder, almost deafening, as the figure extended an arm, pointing directly at her. Amelia felt a surge of cold fear as she stumbled back. The box in her hands began to vibrate again, almost as if responding to the figure's presence. She clutched it tighter, unsure if it was protecting her or drawing her closer to danger. The figure took another step, its movements deliberate and calculated. She tried to speak, to demand answers, but her throat felt dry, her voice trapped by the weight of the moment. The whispers suddenly stopped, replaced by a single booming voice that echoed through the twisted forest. "You've crossed the threshold," it said, its tone deep and commanding. "What you seek cannot be undone." Amelia's grip on the box faltered as the figure stopped just a few feet away. She could feel its presence, overwhelming and suffocating, but she still couldn't see its face. "Where is my brother?" she managed to choke out, her voice barely audible. The figure tilted its head, almost curiously, before responding in a voice that sent chills down her spine. He chose to stay. The words hung in the air, heavy and final, as the ground beneath her began to shift. Amelia felt herself sinking, the glowing moss pulling at her feet. She struggled to move, to fight against whatever was dragging her down, but it was no use. The figure remained still, watching her with an unreadable intensity as she sank deeper into the ground. The last thing she saw before the darkness consumed her was the faint, flickering glow of the box in her hands. Amelia's senses were overwhelmed as the glowing moss swallowed her whole. The weight of the earth around her pressed in from all sides, cold and damp, muffling the hum that had followed her since the beginning. She clenched her fists around the box, the only thing grounding her in the suffocating darkness. Then, just as panic began to overtake her, everything stopped. She gasped as her body jerked free, falling into an open void. For a moment, she felt weightless, her limbs flailing against the nothingness. Then her feet hit solid ground, the impact sending a sharp jolt through her legs. The darkness lifted, replaced by a dim, flickering light that illuminated a cavernous space stretching farther than she could see. The air was thick and damp, carrying a metallic tang that burned her nose. Amelia turned, the box still clutched tightly in her hands, its faint vibrations now steady and rhythmic. The cavern wasn't empty. Faint figures lined the walls, their shapes barely visible in the weak light. As she squinted, she realized they weren't people but statues, roughly carved and arranged in unervingly deliberate rows. Each one was different, their faces twisted in expressions of fear, anger, or grief. They seemed frozen mid-motion, as though they had been caught in their final moments. The hum returned, louder now, resonating through the cavern like a heartbeat. Amelia's own pulse quickened as she took a cautious step forward, her breath coming in short, sharp gasps. The floor beneath her feet was smooth and cold, carved from a stone that shimmered faintly in the dim light. The box seemed to grow warmer in her hands, almost as if urging her forward. Then she saw it. In the center of the cavern, a tall, jagged spire jutted upward, its surface covered in the same ancient symbols she had seen in the clearing above. At its base stood another figure, this one unmistakably human. Amelia's heart leaped as she recognized him. "Ethan!" she cried, her voice echoing off the cavern walls. He turned slowly, his movements mechanical, and for a brief moment, relief washed over her. But as her eyes adjusted, the details came into focus. His face was pale and gaunt, his eyes glowing faintly with an unnatural light. He looked like her brother, but something about him was wrong, as if he were caught between being himself and something else. "Amelia," he said, his voice flat and emotionless. "You shouldn't have come." She stumbled toward him, her hands trembling. "Ethan, it's me. I came to bring you home." He shook his head slowly, his glowing eyes fixed on the box in her hands. "You don't understand. None of this is what it seems. That box. It wasn't meant for you." Amelia's grip tightened instinctively. "What are you talking about?" "I've been following the signs, the carvings. Everything led me here." Ethan's expression shifted, a flicker of something almost human crossing his face before it vanished. "They didn't lead you. They lured you. That box is a key, but it opens more than you can imagine. You've already crossed the threshold, Amelia. There's no going back." She stared at him, her mind racing. "What happened to you? What is this place?" Before he could answer, the hum surged, a deafening roar that reverberated through the cavern. The statues lining the walls began to shift, their stone surfaces cracking as faint beams of light seeped through. Amelia's blood ran cold as one by one, the statues began to move, their rigid forms breaking free from the stone. They turned toward her in unison, their eyes glowing the same eerie light as Ethan's. "Amelia," Ethan said urgently, stepping closer. "Listen to me. You need to let go of the box. Now." But she couldn't. It felt fused to her hands, its warmth now a searing heat. The hum grew louder, drowning out Ethan's voice as the glowing figures began to close in. She tried to back away, but the ground beneath her feet seemed to shift, trapping her in place. The last thing she saw before the light consumed her was Ethan reaching out. His face a mix of desperation and something she couldn't quite name, hope. Then, everything exploded into blinding white, and the world fell silent. When the blinding light faded, Amelia found herself standing in a vast, endless expanse. The cavern, the statues, and even Ethan were gone. The ground beneath her feet shimmered like glass, reflecting a distorted image of the sky above, a swirling canvas of dark clouds and faint, glowing threads of light. She turned in slow circles, clutching the box, which now felt cool in her hands. The hum was gone, replaced by an oppressive silence that made her chest tighten. Then, a voice cut through the stillness, deep and resonant. "You have come farther than most." It wasn't Ethan's voice. It was something ancient, commanding, and impossibly loud, though it seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "And yet, you still do not understand." Amelia spun around, searching for the source. Slowly, the threads of light above began to converge, twisting and coiling into a form. It took shape before her. A towering figure with a face that seemed to shift constantly, its features never staying still long enough for her to comprehend. Its body was woven from the light itself, pulsing and alive. "Who are you?" Amelia managed to whisper, her voice trembling. "I am the architect," the figure said, its voice reverberating through the air. "The one who shaped the key you hold and the gate it opens. It was never meant for you." Amelia's grip on the box tightened. "I came for my brother. Where is he? What did you do to him?" The architect tilted its shifting head. "Your brother chose his path, as you have now chosen yours. This place is not for mortals. It is the space between creation and destruction, a threshold that must remain closed." "Then why did you lure me here?" she demanded, anger flaring in her voice. "Why carve his name, his voice, his face? Why pull me into this if I don't belong?" "You misunderstand," the architect said, its tone almost amused. "I did not lure you. The key seeks its wielder. It does not distinguish between intent and destiny. You brought yourself here." Amelia's mind raced. The box in her hands, the carvings, the hum, it all led back to this. "What does the key open?" she asked, though a part of her feared the answer. The architect paused, its form flickering. "It opens possibility, creation, destruction. What lies on the other side depends on the one who turns the lock." The weight of its words hit her like a blow. She looked down at the box, its surface smooth and unassuming, yet somehow impossibly heavy. "I don't want this," she said, shaking her head. "I just want my brother." "You cannot separate the two," the architect replied. "To free him you must decide. The door will open, and the choice will be yours alone." The ground beneath her rippled as a towering gateway rose from the shimmering expanse. Its surface was dark and featureless, save for a keyhole glowing faintly in the center. Amelia stepped closer, her hands trembling as the box began to vibrate once more. Behind her, a voice called out, Ethan's voice. She turned to see him standing in the distance, his figure flickering like a fading light. "Amelia, don't," he shouted, his tone desperate. "You don't know what's on the other side." She hesitated, her heart pounding. The architect's form grew brighter, its voice pressing. "Choose, Amelia. Creation or destruction. Life or death. It is your choice." Tears blurred her vision as she turned back to the gateway. She didn't know what would happen. If Ethan would be freed, if the forest would return to normal, or if everything would be consumed by whatever lay beyond. But one thing was clear. There was no turning back. Taking a deep breath, she lifted the box, aligning it with the keyhole. As the vibrations grew stronger, Ethan's voice reached her again, quieter this time. "Amelia, you don't have to do this." The final twist came as she looked at her brother, a flicker of doubt in her eyes. In that moment she realized something. His voice, his presence, it hadn't felt real since the beginning. Ethan wasn't pleading to stop her. He was pleading for himself. His glowing eyes in the cavern, his mechanical movements, the way he had spoken about the box. It all clicked. "You're not Ethan," she said, her voice steady. The figure that had been her brother froze, its flickering image breaking apart. The architect's form shifted, the light intensifying. "You are more perceptive than most," it said, almost approving. "Now you truly understand the cost." With trembling hands, Amelia made her choice. The gateway pulsed, and the world shattered into light. When the light faded, Amelia found herself lying on the soft forest floor. The air was cool and still, the dense canopy above filtering gentle rays of sunlight. She sat up slowly, her head pounding and her limbs heavy. The box was gone, its weight no longer pulling at her hands. Around her, the forest seemed normal. Birds chirped in the distance, and the rustling of leaves in the breeze filled the silence that had haunted her for so long. For a moment, she wondered if it had all been a dream. The glowing cavern, the architect, the twisted version of Ethan. It felt impossibly distant, like a memory slipping through her fingers. But as her eyes adjusted, she noticed the pedestal in the clearing. It was cracked and crumbling, the carvings faint as though eroded by time. Whatever had bound the forest to its strange power was gone, leaving only remnants of what had been. She staggered to her feet, brushing dirt from her hands. The realization that she was alone hit her like a wave. "Ethan," she called out, her voice breaking the quiet. She spun around, searching for any sign of him. The memory of his face, the real Ethan, flooded her mind, bringing with it a mix of hope and sorrow. She had come to find him, to bring him home. Had she failed? Her heart sank as she turned to leave the clearing, but then, faintly, she heard it. Voice. Not distorted or twisted, but clear and familiar. "Amelia." She froze, her breath catching in her throat. Turning slowly, she saw him. Ethan. He was standing at the edge of the clearing, his figure solid and real. His face tired but unmistakably his. "Ethan," she cried, running to him. She threw her arms around him, feeling the warmth of his body, the strength in his embrace. "You're here. You're really here." He held her tightly, his voice soft and filled with relief. "I don't know how, but I think you saved me." They pulled back, and she searched his face for answers. "What happened to you? I thought I lost you forever." Ethan looked past her, his expression troubled. "It's hard to explain. That place, it wasn't just the forest. It was something else, something ancient. Traps you, makes you forget who you are. I thought I'd never escape." Amelia nodded, understanding more than she could put into words. "It's over now," she said firmly, gripping his hand. "We're going home." As they walked through the forest, the trees seemed brighter, the air lighter. It felt alive again, no longer weighed down by the strange energy that had lingered there. Amelia didn't know what the architect truly was or why the box had chosen her, but she knew the forest was free, and so was Ethan. When they reached the edge of the woods, the world opened up before them. The sun was setting, casting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and gold. For the first time in years, Amelia felt a sense of peace. Whatever she had unleashed, whatever choice she had made, it had brought her brother back. As they walked toward the horizon, Ethan glanced at her, a faint smile on his lips. "You've always been stubborn, you know that?" She laughed softly, squeezing his hand. Someone had to be. And with that, they left the forest behind, stepping into a new chapter, one filled with questions they might never answer, but also with hope they hadn't felt in a long time.